They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I'd stay silent. But one folder, one set of letters, and I realized they couldn't take what he truly intended for me. The truth was mine to hold, and mine alone. It all began on a gray Wednesday morning when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed distant. The first thing I noticed was the faint scent of aged paper as I stepped into Patrick's study. The air smelled like memories, like the years we had built together in careful harmony, and yet beneath it there was something different, almost like a whisper from the past. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the desk drawer, the one he had always kept locked with a simple brass key. I turned it, and there it was, a folder tucked behind old ledgers and dusty receipts, its edges worn but purposeful. I slid it out slowly, as if handling a fragile relic, and felt the weight of decades in my fingers. Each sheet of paper was written in his hand, meticulous and deliberate, and as I flipped through them, a wave of disbelief swept over me. For 43 years, I had trusted, loved, and lived with him, yet these letters revealed a dimension of his intentions I had never fully known. It was as if he had anticipated the shadows, the hidden hands that might try to erase me. I settled into the leather chair, letting the letters fall open on the desk, and began to read. The first note was brief but pointed. To my dearest, should anything be unsettled after I'm gone, remember the promises I've made. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight heavier than any spoken conversation. My eyes scanned the margins, annotations, and crossed-out passages. He had foreseen the possibility that some members of the family might attempt to claim more than their share, that greed could overshadow love, and he had left guidance hidden within these pages. As I read, memories came flooding back, small details I had overlooked over the years. The afternoons we spent in the garden, the quiet evenings discussing family plans, the little ways he always included me in decisions that mattered. And yet, despite this history, I knew that those who sought to control his legacy might not see it the same way. The folder in front of me was more than just letters. It was a shield, a silent testament to the life we had shared, a blueprint for what was rightfully mine. The minutes turned into hours as I pored over the letters, uncovering instructions, reminders, and private messages meant for no one else. One particularly revealing note outlined a series of bequests, emphasizing fairness and intention, even in the face of disputes. It was clear now why the will had always felt slightly incomplete, why certain family members had sensed ambiguity. Patrick had anticipated the shadows and had left me the keys to restore balance if chaos arose. I leaned back, the folder resting on my lap, and felt a mixture of anger, sorrow, and resolve. The betrayal I suspected from my daughter-in-law, Rebecca, suddenly seemed more concrete. She had always been poised, confident, and strategic, with a subtle way of twisting facts and relationships in her favor. For months after Patrick's passing, I had sensed her encroachment, her casual dismissals, her pointed remarks in family meetings, the way she assumed decisions were hers to make. And yet, as I held the letters, I realized that her efforts to erase me would never succeed. Not while the truth had been preserved in his careful, deliberate handwriting. My thoughts wandered to Daniel, my longtime friend and confidant, who had always quietly observant, never rushing to judgment, but always present when clarity was needed. He would understand the significance of these letters, the way Patrick had quietly orchestrated safeguards without creating confrontation. It was a testament to his foresight and to the silent strength we both shared, the ability to act deliberately, with patience and with dignity intact. The study was still, the sunlight filtering through the window casting warm streaks across the floor. I closed my eyes briefly and let the gravity of the discovery settle. The letters were more than paper. They were a lifeline, a map through the intricate maze of family dynamics, greed, and unspoken power struggles. In their margins were the subtle markers of his voice, the nuances that only someone who had shared a lifetime with him could fully appreciate. And then came the quiet realization. I had the choice now. I could let the uncertainty and fear paralyze me, allow others to dictate the story of our lives, or I could take measured steps, guided by Patrick's words, to reclaim what had been quietly promised to me. Every note, every line, every annotation became a part of my strategy, not out of vengeance, but out of the need to honor his intentions and protect our shared legacy. The clock ticked slowly, yet it felt like time itself had paused for this moment of reckoning. I could almost hear Patrick's voice, gentle but firm, reminding me that the most powerful justice is often the quietest. It does not announce itself with shouts or displays of anger. It moves subtly, deliberately, with precision, and always with integrity. I carefully placed the folder back in the drawer, aligning it perfectly as if the physical order mattered as much as the words themselves. Then I rose, a new sense of clarity and purpose settling over me. The path ahead would require patience, careful observation, and quiet maneuvering, but I knew that I was prepared. The truth was preserved, and I had the letters as proof. No one could take that from me. For the first time since Patrick's passing, I felt a flicker of calm determination. The betrayal that had loomed over me for weeks no longer seemed insurmountable. The letters had given me something even more valuable than legal guidance. They had given me the knowledge that I was never truly alone in this fight. Patrick's foresight, his trust, and his love were etched into every word, and with them, I could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The house was quiet, the study still bathed in soft morning light. I knew that this was only the beginning, the first step in a journey that would test patience, resilience, and courage. But as I looked at the folder one last time, I whispered to myself, "They will not erase me. Not today, not ever." Patrick had always been a man of quiet strength, the kind whose presence filled a room without words. When I think back on our life together, it is not the grand gestures that stand out, but the small, deliberate moments that built the foundation of our family and our home. We had spent decades cultivating trust, love, and shared responsibility, and yet even the strongest bonds could be threatened by those blinded by greed. Our home was more than bricks and timber. It was a testament to years of careful planning, shared dreams, and the promise that what we built together would endure. Each room, each corner, each carefully chosen object held memories that spoke to our history. The living room, with its worn leather chairs and the scent of aged books, held the evenings we spent discussing our children's future. The garden outside carried the echoes of our laughter, our conversations about life, and the quiet satisfaction of watching things grow under our care. Patrick was deliberate in all things. He believed that clarity and structure were essential, not only for the well-being of the family, but also for preserving dignity in times of uncertainty. That same meticulous nature had led him to write the letters I now held. Even in the face of his passing, he had anticipated the challenges that might arise, the subtle manipulations and undercurrents that could threaten the legacy we had nurtured together. And then there was Rebecca, my daughter-in-law, whose ambitions had always carried a polished edge. She was charming, articulate, and outwardly kind, yet beneath the surface there was a drive that often eclipsed the natural course of fairness. I had always sensed her subtle attempts to assert influence, to shape narratives in her favor, but never had I imagined the lengths she would go to remove me from the picture entirely. Her presence in family discussions had grown steadily more assertive, her opinions voiced with confidence that sometimes bordered on imperiousness. Our son, Daniel, loved his mother deeply, but he was often caught in the tension between familial loyalty and external persuasion. I knew his intentions were never malicious, but the influence of Rebecca had begun to shift the dynamics in ways that left me uneasy. The estate, the legacy, and even the memory of Patrick's wishes seemed increasingly at risk, and yet there had always been a sense that the truth, carefully preserved, would eventually surface. I remembered the evenings we spent together, Patrick and I, discussing the future. The conversations were never about confrontation or power. They were about clarity, fairness, and ensuring that love and responsibility guided every decision. He had been aware that human nature could be flawed, that greed and ambition could seep into even the most devoted hearts, and he had taken steps to guard against that. The letters I had found were the culmination of his foresight, a safeguard for the family he cherished and the principles he held dear. Looking back, I could see the small, almost imperceptible signs that things might one day become complicated. The way certain conversations were interrupted, the subtle glances that spoke more than words, the unspoken hierarchy that had begun to form in the household. Patrick had noticed it too, and the letters were his way of navigating the inevitable turbulence with grace and foresight. As I walked through the rooms of our home, each memory came alive. The kitchen where he had taught me the value of patience and precision, the study where he had drafted every plan with careful attention, the garden where the seasons reminded us that growth and resilience required both time and nurturing. Every detail mattered, not just as a reflection of our life together, but as a guide for the challenges that lay ahead. The family had always been central to Patrick's vision, and he had entrusted me with the responsibility of upholding that vision vision. I had been co-architect of our shared life, yet now the letters revealed nuances and intentions that I had not fully grasped until this moment. They reminded me that love and trust were active, living forces that required vigilance and commitment even in the absence of one's partner. As I prepared to confront the reality of Rebecca's growing influence, I knew that patience would be my ally. This was not a battle to be won through force or confrontation, but through observation, understanding, and the strategic use of the truth Patrick had left behind. The letters were my roadmap, and with each page I read, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet determination to uphold the integrity of our family legacy. I recalled the day Patrick had entrusted me with certain keys, not just to doors, but to understanding his broader intentions. It was never about control or dominance. It was about ensuring that the values we had cultivated would endure, that fairness and love would guide the next generation, and that those who sought to disrupt our harmony would be met with the quiet strength of truth. Even in moments of doubt, I found reassurance in the meticulous details of his life and our shared memories. The letters had given me more than information, they had given me perspective, a lens through which to see both the threats and the opportunities. I understood now that patience, observation, and deliberate action would be the keys to preserving not only what was rightfully mine, but what Patrick had always hoped to protect. By the end of the day, the study felt like a sanctuary, a space where the past and present converged and where I could gather the strength to face the challenges ahead. The letters were no longer just pieces of paper. They were instruments of justice, reminders of love, and the blueprint for reclaiming my place in the family with dignity intact. For the first time since discovering the folder, I allowed myself a moment of calm reflection. The past had been complicated, the present was uncertain, but the future, guided by truth and careful strategy, felt within reach. I knew the journey would be long, filled with careful steps, quiet observations, and strategic decisions, but I also knew that with the letters as my guide, I could navigate every obstacle that lay in my path. The next morning, I did not sleep well. The letters had settled in my chest like a slow-burning ember, and I found myself replaying each line, each careful instruction. I needed someone steady, someone who would read the papers without hurry and see what I saw. Daniel was the first person I called. He was my son, but more than that, he had always been my confidant, the one who listened like a friend and acted like a protector. When he arrived, he carried with him that calm patience I had relied on for years. We sat at the kitchen table with the folder between us, the light of the window painting the paper in soft strokes. Daniel read slowly, his forehead creasing only once or twice. He did not speak until he had turned every page. Then he looked up at me with an expression that held both sorrow and quiet resolve. He said, "I had no idea." And I believed him. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the documents down, as if he too felt the weight of what had been hidden. It did not take long for us to compare the letters with the will drafts that had been circulated after Patrick passed. There were inconsistencies that nagged at us. Certain clauses seemed altered. Signatures looked too neat in places where Patrick had always written with a small impatient curl, and entire paragraphs felt out of character. The will had become a patchwork of voices, some of which did not belong within our family home. I felt a cold clarity wash over me. Someone had been rewriting the threads of our life. Daniel suggested we bring in someone to read the documents with an expert eye. I knew the right person. Lydia had been our family attorney for years, a woman of precise language and steady principles. She did not scare easily, and she understood how paper could be shaped into power. When we met with her, I watched her hands move across the paper like a surgeon reading charts. She took notes, asked careful questions, and nodded in that way that said she was seeing patterns emerge. Lydia pointed out the telltale signs of manipulation. There were dates that did not align with Patrick's handwriting samples. Marginal notes were missing where Patrick would usually leave them. The document that had been presented as definitive bore signs of hurried forgery and sloppy inclusions. It felt deliberate, as if someone had hoped haste would hide the truth. Lydia's voice remained steady, but I could hear the edge of anger beneath her professionalism. She said we could challenge the will, but we would need proof and testimony. It was at that moment that the strategy shifted from shock to action. My shock had been private and raw. Now it needed to become a measured, procedural response. I was not a woman who wanted spectacle. I wanted facts, witnesses, and a path that led to restoration rather than further drama. Patrick had not left room for spectacle either. His letters were tactical, suggesting witnesses, certain ledgers to check, and people who had been present at key moments. He had thought ahead, as he always did. We began to assemble evidence. Daniel called old acquaintances who had known Patrick in business and in life. He tracked down receipts, dated letters, and even a few photographs where Patrick had jotted notes on the back. Each piece added texture to the picture and pushed the murky parts of the will toward daylight. I found that observation could be a weapon when used patiently. Each small paper trail we uncovered felt like another brick returning to the house we had built together. At times, the heat of anger rose inside me. I imagined Rebecca in her immaculate shoes, arranging dinners and smiling as if the world were hers. There were moments when I wanted to confront her directly, to let words fall like stones and leave nothing unturned. But the letters reminded me of Patrick's voice. He had always counseled patience and method. He had wanted dignity, not drama. I folded my anger into strategy and let Daniel take the lead on the tactical moves. Daniel proved to be a steady captain. He arranged meetings with Lydia, he called a meeting of the foundation board, and he quietly asked questions that revealed cracks in Rebecca's narrative. One staff member mentioned a call from Rebecca on the day the draft will had supposedly been finalized. Another recalled a lunch where Rebecca had insisted certain changes were needed for convenience. Each recollection seemed small on its own, but layered together, they painted a troubling picture. There were nights when I lay awake thinking about what had been done in the name of convenience. It always baffled me how greed could appear so polite. The same smiles that offered coffee could also offer erasure. I found myself returning to a single sentence from one of Patrick's letters. He had written, "If love is not the guiding hand, then paper must be." That line became my quiet mantra. If love was not speaking for me, then proof would. In the course of our review, we found a signature that did not match Patrick's usual hand. It was careful, almost too deliberate, as if the person copying it had mimicked the stroke rather than lived it. Lydia made a notation and suggested a handwriting expert. It felt almost bizarre that such a person would be required in our lives. But the world had changed, and so had the ways people sought to rewrite stories. Daniel placed a call to an expert recommended by Lydia and arranged for a discreet consultation. As we worked, the family dynamics shifted in subtle ways. Rebecca became briefer at gatherings, her smiles slightly tighter. She began to speak more loudly about practical matters and less about sentiment. I could feel the air change around her, as if the house itself were sensing the truth. People who had been openly deferential to her started to ask quieter questions. It was a slow tide, but the current had begun to move in our favor. I also found allies in unexpected places. Ava, a woman who had once worked in our household and had left on good terms, reached out. She had noticed small things, odd conversations, things that did not fit the pattern of our family life. Ava's recollections were candid and specific. She remembered seeing Rebecca with a set of documents in a hurried moment, and the way Rebecca had insisted that we were being overly cautious. Ava did not have formal authority, but she had a memory that mattered. With every new piece of testimony, my confidence grew. The letters had been a key, and now, piece by piece, we were unlocking doors. I was careful not to let triumph swell into arrogance. This was not about humiliating anyone. This was about truth and the quiet restoration of balance. Patrick had built this life on principles, and it was our duty to honor those principles with care and without spectacle. The day the handwriting expert confirmed suspicions felt surreal. He spoke in measured tones, explaining differences in pressure and stroke that only an expert would notice. He did not cast blame in dramatic phrases. He simply presented his findings, and in that calm delivery, the truth lengthened and gained weight. They had tried to weave a new ending, but the thread frayed under scrutiny. When Daniel and I left Lydia's office that evening, the sky was a deep, forgiving blue. There was still much to do. There would be meetings and legal steps and moments of tension. But the path forward had clarity now. We had evidence, witnesses, and the steady support of people who valued principle over convenience. The ember of the letters had become a steady flame, and I felt it warm the parts of me that had been chilled by doubt. I understood then that justice in our house would be less about loud declarations and more about careful, intentional work. The narrative had been challenged, but it was not broken. Patrick's words had given us a framework, and with each careful step, we moved closer to restoring what was rightfully ours. I felt the old steadiness return, that patient strength that had always been the backbone of our life. The next moves would require more patience and more proof, but I was no longer merely reacting. I was orchestrating a response that would honor Patrick and the life we had built together. Ava arrived at the house with an envelope in her hands and a look that said she had come to give more than comfort. She had worked for us for years and had left on terms that were kind and respectful. I had always trusted her memory because she noticed things others dismissed. When she set the envelope on the kitchen table, I felt a small surge of hope. Inside were notes she had taken, dates she remembered, and a small receipt that matched a day when changes to the papers had been discussed. She told the story simply and without flourish. She had seen Rebecca with a stack of papers the week before the final will had been circulated. Rebecca had been nervous and habitually tidy, but that day her hands had trembled as she refolded a sheet and slid it into a file. Ava had asked a question, and Rebecca had laughed it off. At the time, Ava had not thought much of it, but later those small moments gained weight. Ava described the details in a way that made the memory feel very present. She mentioned the exact afternoon light, the way Rebecca had tucked the paper into her bag, and the sound of the front gate as she left. I listened and let each memory settle. There was power in the ordinary. People often assumed that truth required spectacle. In our case, truth was stitched into a pattern of small actions. Ava had become a witness to that pattern, and her testimony now mattered as much as any formal document. I felt gratitude for her courage in coming forward. She had no obligation to involve herself. She had simply wanted justice and clarity. Lydia took Ava seriously. Lydia was methodical and gentle, but she was not naive. She asked precise questions, dates and times, and she cross-referenced what Ava remembered with the other pieces we had collected. When Ava mentioned the receipt, there was a small tightening in Lydia's expression. She said we could use that as a corroborating detail. Proof rarely arrived as a single dramatic revelation. It usually came as a quiet accumulation of consistent facts. The next step Lydia recommended was a deposition. She explained that an official statement from Ava could be used in court if necessary, and that the process would show we were not acting on impulse. The idea of putting Ava under oath felt solemn. I watched her sit with dignity and describe what she had seen. Her voice was steady and honest, and with each sentence the picture of what had transpired became clearer. There were practical measures to take as well. Lydia suggested we request formal copies from the bank of any recent transactions that seemed out of pattern. She recommended a request to the notary who would handle the will drafts, and she proposed contacting a digital archivist who might recover older versions of documents. It felt strange and modern to think of archived files and email metadata, but I had learned that paper was no longer the only place truth lived. Patrick had written many of his notes by hand, but in our era, we had to consider all forms of record. As these steps unfolded, I noticed a new steadiness in myself. The initial shock had been replaced by focused action. I found that planning felt like prayer. It aligned nerves into purpose. I organized the letters, flagged key passages, and prepared a list of questions for witnesses. In private, I rehearsed my voice so it would sound calm and clear at the meetings to come. I had no desire to be theatrical. Patrick had always taught me that dignity carries its own authority. There were moments when the tension felt almost unbearable. I would catch myself imagining Rebecca's face when the truth was laid out. I pictured her adjusting a smile that would no longer fit. But then I would remember Ava's envelope, the handwriting expert's notes, Lydia's steady counsel, and the folder in my study. Those anchors kept me balanced. Part of the work was internal. I had to manage my own anger so it would not blur the facts. I wanted justice that restored rather than destroyed. One afternoon, Lydia brought a quiet but critical ally into our circle. She introduced us to a retired archivist named Martin who had once worked with legal teams to trace document histories. He arrived with a small satchel and a set of questions that seemed to belong to another era. He handled paper with reverence and used tools that lent an almost forensic calm to the process.
He examined the folds, the paper grain, and the slight differences in ink tones. His observations were technical, but not cold. They brought texture and dimension to what we already suspected. Martin pointed out a series of marginal notes that matched Patrick's habit of shorthand notations. He showed how those notes aligned with earlier ledgers and how the receipts Ava had found fit into a timeline of changes. This was the kind of detail that could not be easily dismissed. It was not flashy, it was precise and meticulous, and that precision made the case stronger. As the evidence assembled, Lydia began to lay out possible legal paths.
There would be filings and hearings and perhaps a formal challenge to the document that sought to rewrite Patrick's intentions. We prepared ourselves for the possibility of a public dispute, but we also planned for the more likely outcome of careful negotiation. I preferred the latter. I wanted the truth acknowledged and the legacy honored without tearing the family apart. At home, I kept tending to small rituals. I swept the garden path in the mornings, and I tended the roses that had always been Patrick's favorite. Those familiar tasks grounded me. They reminded me that life continued between the larger motions of dispute and defense. I also began to write my own notes, not legal drafts, but reflections on the life we had made and the values I intended to protect. The letters had given me instruction. My notes became a companion to them. Daniel carried much of the external work. He made calls, arranged meetings, and navigated the practical hurdles that come with legal processes. His steadiness was a comfort. At times, he would place a hand on my shoulder and say nothing. That silence felt supportive. He did not seek to lead in a way that overshadowed my role. He acted as a partner in the way Patrick would have wanted. The turning point was not a single moment. It was a slow coalescence of testimony, technical validation, and quiet determination. Each piece of evidence added weight. Each witness who came forward shifted the balance a little more toward truth. The house itself seemed to breathe more easily, as if the walls could sense the unfolding of justice. One evening, as rain traced thin lines down the window panes, I sat with the letters and reread a passage that had always felt like guidance. Patrick had written that fairness must be defended gently and firmly. That sentence had been the lodestar for every decision since. It reminded me that our work was not to punish, but to restore. It kept my actions aligned with a deeper purpose. We were ready to act with precision. We had testimonies, technical corroboration, and a plan that respected dignity. The day would come when the facts would be presented and the truth would be visible to those who needed to see it. I felt a quiet confidence that the house I loved would stand through this, not because I had sought a fight, but because I had chosen to protect what was right and to honor the man whose letters had shown me the way. The board meeting was arranged for a Wednesday afternoon when most members could attend. We chose the smaller conference room because it felt less like a courtroom and more like a place where honest conversation could happen. I wanted the space to reflect the way Patrick had always handled difficult matters, with a calm table, steady chairs, and the soft hum of an ordinary day. The letters were in my bag, folded carefully, and surrounded by photocopies and notes. I had rehearsed my voice so it would sound measured and sure. As people filed into the room, I noticed the small rituals that made this house a community. Hands clasped, polite nods, the way certain members chose seats near the window for better light. Rebecca arrived with her composed air, a smile practiced and polished. She greeted board members the way a hostess might greet guests at a dinner she intended to direct. There was a confidence in her stride that I had once admired in youth and that now read as strategy. The meeting began with routine items, the kind of administrative matters that invited nothing but perfunctory agreement. I listened to the first few reports with a steady attention, letting the customary cadence settle the room. Then Daniel rose and asked if we might address a matter of estate documentation. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness that made people look up. Lydia handed out copies of the contested will and a summary of the findings. She did so without fanfare, as if the facts deserved only the dignity of a plain presentation. I felt my pulse steady as the letters made their quiet entrance into the room. Lydia spoke of dates, comparisons, and anomalies in a voice that did not seek drama. She introduced the handwriting expert and the archivist who had explained the marginal notes in paper grain. Each person added a layer of clarity. As the technical details were shared, the room shifted from polite curiosity to focused attention. It was a slow but unmistakable tightening of awareness. Rebecca listened and then smiled in that measured way that had become her shield. She spoke first, offering an explanation about clerical updates and last-minute practicalities. Her words were smooth, but the room had changed. People listened now for the shape of truth rather than for the comfort of deference. One by one, small faces that had once deferred to her began to ask direct questions. The questions were not accusatory. They were practical and insistently precise. When Lydia presented the photocopies of Patrick's letters and read a passage aloud, the timbre of the room altered. Her voice delivered the words without flourish, and in doing so she revealed an intimacy that only years of shared life could justify. The passage spoke of fairness, of intention, and of the responsibility to honor promises made in private. The letters were not evidence of grand gestures. They were evidence of consistent care and thought. I watched Rebecca as the words landed. For a moment she maintained composure, but I saw the small crack form at the corner of her smile. She shifted in her chair, a subtle gesture that betrayed a human reaction. That small imperfection was all the room needed. People are careful with their faces, and even more careful with their reputations. When the documents placed before them showed a pattern of deliberate instruction, the board members who had been uncertain began to nod toward the logic of fairness. A senior board member, a woman who had known Patrick for decades, spoke up. She spoke not with accusation, but with a memory that mattered. She recalled conversations where Patrick had detailed his wishes in small, precise terms that matched the letters. Her voice carried the weight of history and the authority of someone who had lived alongside the man they had respected. Her recollection lent moral context to the technical evidence, and the room took that context to heart. Rebecca attempted to counter with a narrative of administrative necessity. She argued that certain adjustments had been suggested for efficiency and continuity. Her voice sought to make practicality seem more important than principle. But practicality cannot explain notes written with affection, and the specific instruction that particular bequests remain as intended. The letters had voices that practicality could not replicate. There were moments when I felt the tremor of old fear. I knew that vindication does not always arrive in straight lines. Legalities can bend, and people can be clever in ways that frustrate simple truth. Yet as the meeting progressed, the pattern of evidence made obfuscation less tenable. Lydia asked for a show of consensus on a procedural step to validate the original intentions. One by one, board members signaled support for preserving Patrick's clear wishes as outlined in his letters. When the room reached a quiet agreement to restore the original allocations and to investigate further without public spectacle, a weight lifted. It was not the triumphant victory of drama. It was the steady reassurance that the right thing had been acknowledged. Rebecca did not shout. She folded with a small formal nod that was all the concession she could afford. There was no courtroom confrontation. There was instead the sober work of correction. After the meeting, I found myself walking slowly through the garden where Patrick had spent so many mornings. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth. I paused at the rose bush he had planted and placed a hand against the old stem. It felt real and ordinary and exactly like the life he had built. The resolution at the board was not the end of the process. There would be formal filings and adjustments, but the core truth had been recognized by those who mattered. People approached me in small groups, offering condolences and quiet congratulations. Some apologized for not seeing it sooner. Others thanked me for preserving the dignity that Patrick had intended. I accepted their words with a composed gratitude that felt both earned and gentle. I thought of Ava, of Lydia, of Daniel, and of the archivist. Each had played a role that honored the letters and honored Patrick's trust. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with Daniel. We did not speak of triumph. We spoke instead of the practical work ahead. We organized documents, prepared next steps, and wrote notes for the formal filings. It felt like continuing a conversation Patrick might have had with us. The letters had been instruments of guidance, and now they would be instruments of restoration. In the quiet of the night, I allowed myself a small moment to read one of Patrick's letters again. The handwriting was familiar, the ink slightly faded at the edges. He had written, "Leave things better than you found them."
That sentence moved me more than any legal finding. It reminded me that our work was not about settling scores, but about stewardship. Justice in our house was about honoring a life and making sure that the legacy lived on in truth. The next days were filled with measured actions. The formal documents were amended where necessary, and the foundation board issued a statement acknowledging the steps taken to restore Patrick's intentions. The language was careful and kind. It did not vilify, it only restored. It was, in its quiet way, the exact kind of justice Patrick had written into his letters. I found that victory tasted like relief and responsibility combined. It did not erase the hurt or the hours of worry. It did not undo the moments when I had felt small, but it reaffirmed what I had always believed about our life together. The letters had been a bridge between his care and my courage. In honoring them, I honored him and the life we had built. After the board meeting, the days returned to a gentler rhythm, one that felt closer to the life Patrick and I had lived before the shadow of doubt settled over our home. The formal filings were completed with care and without spectacle. The foundation issued a short statement that acknowledged the restoration of Patrick's intentions and invited the board to move forward with renewed clarity. The language was simple and steady, the kind of language Patrick would have preferred. It did not demand apologies, it only requested honesty and fairness. I found myself returning to the study more often, not to hunt for evidence, but to sit with the letters and remember. I took time to index each page, noting dates and details, and then I placed them in a small archival box we had kept for family papers. I did this carefully, with the ritual of someone who understands the importance of memory. The box went onto the highest shelf in the study, not hidden, but protected.
It felt right to give the letters a place where they could watch over the house as quietly as they had guided me. The garden rewarded my attention. The roses that Patrick had planted in early spring were coming back strong, and I took comfort in the steady work of pruning and tending. It is remarkable how physical labor can steady the heart. When I clipped a dead stem, I thought of the ways a family sometimes needs trimming to keep the roots healthy. The seasons teach patience. The work of restoration in our home was much the same. It required small, consistent acts rather than a single dramatic gesture. People reached out in ways I had not anticipated. Some offered gentle apologies for not seeing the signs. Others shared their own stories of family fractures and quiet repairs. It surprised me how many private difficulties live behind polite exteriors. I found that telling my own story opened doors for others to share theirs. In the quiet of the kitchen over tea, neighbors spoke of their own fragile reconciliations. Their words reminded me that our experience was both unique and strangely common. Rebecca did not come to me seeking forgiveness. She sent a short note acknowledging the board's decision and expressing a wish for the family to heal. It was courteous and restrained. I did not feel compelled to respond at length. I wrote back a brief message that spoke of hope for peaceful days and a wish that she might find a place of service within the family that honored both her talents and the boundaries of fairness. I did not expect a deep reconciliation, and perhaps none would come. The work we had done was not intended to humiliate. It was meant to restore balance and protect a life built on careful intention. Daniel remained steady through the days that followed. He did not seek the spotlight. He took care of the administrative tasks and made sure our affairs were in order. His quiet presence was a comfort. One evening we sat on the back porch and watched the light fall over the roses. We did not speak of the legalities. We spoke about small things, the kind of small things that rebuilt trust. He told me about a plan to support the foundation in ways that honored Patrick's values rather than creating new hierarchies. I listened and felt grateful for the way he had shouldered responsibility while allowing me to lead with the letters as my guide. Ava visited often, bringing news of small kindnesses from people who had watched the situation unfold. She had a practical air and a steady humor that reminded me of ordinary life. I found myself making tea for the two of us and listening as she described moments of generosity or the quiet apologies of neighbors. Her presence reminded me that community is often the quiet force that heals what paperwork cannot. There were moments of awkwardness as well. Family gatherings required new boundaries and gentle navigation. People who had once assumed certain roles had to adapt. I found that clarity and intention made these transitions easier. When conversations threatened to drift back into old patterns, I used the letters as a lodestar of principle, not as a weapon. I would remind myself and others that Patrick's wishes were not about control, but about preserving a life he cherished.
As the months passed, I took up small projects that had been on hold. I sorted through old photographs and labeled albums with dates and names. I recorded short notes about the stories behind each picture so the grandchildren would not have to guess. Each small act felt like stitching a new thread into the family fabric. I wanted the next generation to remember not only the moment of dispute, but the whole life that had been lived with care. As the months passed, I took up small projects that had been on hold. I sorted through old photographs and labeled albums with dates and names. I recorded short notes about the stories behind each picture so the grandchildren would not have to guess. Each small act felt like stitching a new thread into the family fabric. I wanted the next generation to remember not only the moment of dispute, but the whole life that had been lived with care. As the months passed, I took up small projects that had been on hold. I sorted through old photographs and labeled albums with dates and names. I recorded short notes about the stories behind each picture so the grandchildren would not have to guess. Each small act felt like stitching a new thread into the family fabric. I wanted the next generation to remember not only the moment of dispute, but the whole life that had been lived with care.
People sometimes ask what justice felt like. For me, it was not an eruption of triumph. It was a softening of the constant knot of worry that had sat in my chest. It was the reassurance that the man I loved had not been misunderstood and that his intentions would guide the family forward. It was also a recognition that trust must be tended and that the work of stewardship is an ongoing responsibility. I did not become a different woman after the letters were revealed. I remained the same person who had loved, laughed, and sometimes cried in this house. What changed was the shape of my confidence. It was no longer brittle or dependent on the kindness of others. It was rooted in the knowledge that truth, when gathered with care, can be a shield. I felt grateful for the people who had stood with me, for the professionals who applied their skills with integrity, and for the quiet endurance that had always been part of my character. One evening, as autumn edged the garden, Daniel suggested we host a small gathering for those who had supported us. It would not be a celebration in the conventional sense. It would be a simple dinner to thank those who had helped us honor Patrick's wishes. The table was small and the food was modest. We spoke of the work ahead for the foundation and the plans to ensure that Patrick's vision would be preserved. There were conversations about scholarships, about community programs, and about the quiet ways the foundation could serve without spectacle. When the guests left and the house settled into its evening routine, I walked through the rooms and paused at the study. I opened the archival box and touched the edges of the letters with a gentleness that felt like reverence. I whispered a small thank you into the quiet air, not because I thought his spirit would need hearing, but because voice gives shape to gratitude. The letters had been instruments of guidance, and now they were instruments of memory. In the months that followed, I felt the house breathe more easily. The laughter returned in small measures and ordinary routines resumed. There were days when I still felt the sting of what had been attempted, but those days were fewer and less sharp. The work of restoring our legacy had taught me that dignity need not be loud to be effective. It taught me that patience, when combined with careful action, can remake a fragile situation into a steadier future. I think often about the idea of being erased and what it means to reclaim a story. For me, reclaiming was not about asserting dominance. It was about insisting that truth and love be the guiding hands. It was about making sure that the next generation had a clear map of what had been intended for them. In honoring Patrick's words, I honored the life we had built together and the simple promise that people keep when they love well. The garden continued to grow, the roses endured, the letters rested on their shelf, watched over, and sometimes consulted. I moved forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested and had learned how to act with dignity. The house was ours again in the way that matters most. The story that Patrick had written with his pen had been preserved, and in preserving it, I preserved a part of both of us. I had not been erased, I had been remembered and restored. The truth had spoken, softly and surely, and in its voice I found the last great consolation.